We're talking about 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and the Norman conquest of England. The thing you need to understand is around 1000, Europe did not look quite like it looks now. Some of it would have been recognizable, but one of the things that was different is that instead of there being a unified France, France was broken up into several different parts. And one part is an area that we call Normandy. Now, Normandy is fascinating because it actually, about a century before 1066, had been settled by, yes, guess what? Vikings. Vikings under a leader named Rollo had come down from Norway, and they had been raiding all along the coastline, and we're going to talk about those raids and things when we get into the Vikings talk. But they had gone up the Seine River and had assaulted Paris several times, had looted Paris. They kept trying to pay them off, and then one of the rulers of the Franks, he was called Charles the Simple. They had great names for guys. You know, there was a fat, there was a bald, all these different names they had for people. Well, Charles the Simple didn't have enough money to bribe the Vikings to go home anymore, so he gave them land. And they settled on property, some of the best property, along near the coast and along the rivers in the area we call Normandy. You, of course, know the name Normandy because the Second World War, the invasion of Europe by the Allied forces, was on Normandy beaches. Normandy literally means land of the Northmen, because those were Vikings. And they had settled in and they had become French. They spoke French at this point, but they still had that adventuresome spirit, I think. And so around 1000 AD, we have the Normans who were living in right across the English Channel from England. Now, this is what England had looked like. This is called the Heptarchy of England. What that meant was the history of England. We'll get into this when we talk a little bit about King Arthur. First, there had been the Aboriginal English, the pre-Celtic, and then the Celts, and the Anglo-Saxons came in from northern Germany and southern Denmark. The Anglo-Saxons had created 7 basically different kingdoms. Each of them had their own king. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex were the largest ones, then Sussex, Kent, Essex, and East Anglia. Those had existed. The most powerful ones were Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, the largest ones. What happened was the Vikings in the late 700s and 800s began to invade. And they took over most of England. In fact, they had taken over all of it except Wessex. There's a television series now called The Last Kingdom. It just started its 2nd season. Well, The Last Kingdom is the kingdom of Wessex. All the others had been taken over by the Vikings, and that series is about that. In Wessex, there was a man who is King Alfred of the Wessex. He is the only king in English history who is known as the Great, because he's the only king of the Saxons who succeeded in fighting off the Vikings. He not only protected Wessex, but he eventually began to take over more land fighting back from the Vikings until we reached the place where much of Wessex and Mercia was controlled by the Anglo-Saxons again, and then there was this area called the Danelaw where the Vikings were in control. Slowly over a period of time, the Vikings got absorbed. They began to speak English, they settled in and started farming, and they came back to being one country again. But there had always been that sense that the Vikings were out there somewhere and they could come back. One of the things that was happening is that when they're getting Viking raids into the 900s, they would come and raid along the coast of England, but remember, Normandy, right across the English Channel, was settled by Vikings. These are cousins. And so after they raided England, the Vikings would go over to Normandy and pull into a harbor and be welcomed and, like old family members, be taken care of, resupplied, and then they go back and raid England again. So England and Normandy did not get along very well because England saw the Normans as supporting the Vikings. In order to try to resolve that problem, they ended up with a very important marriage. And the key to understanding the history here is mostly the women. They're the ones that tied everything together. And in case you haven't figured that out, that's pretty much true down through history. The guys' names are always at the top, but the women are the ones that are making things work underneath. And I hate to do this to you, but the only way to understand some of the reasons for the various conflicts that happened and how history unfolded is by understanding some of the genealogies. So I've got to do this to you, all right? I'm gonna simplify it, so you don't have to worry too much. But this is the House of Wessex, the descendants from Alfred the Great. These are the Saxon kings. This is the great-grandson. Edgar was the great-grandson of Alfred the Great, and he had a son named Ethelred the Unred. Unred is an Old English word which means poorly counseled, bad counsel. But he's become known as Ethelred the Unready because he really wasn't ready for prime time. He really was not ready to be king. He did not do very well. Well, in order to try to solve the conflict they were having between England and Normandy, Ethelred married Emma of Normandy, who was the daughter of Richard, the Duke of Normandy, in order to try to get along better. And it worked. They ended up getting along just fine after that. Normandy actually supported England when they were having problems with some of the Vikings. After Ethelred the Unready died, his son Edmund Ironside, he was called, became king. But in this same period of time, when Edmund Ironside became king, the Vikings were still attacking. There was a fellow named Svein Forkbeard. Again, great names. All of the French nicknames are fat, bald, simple. But these Viking names are like Forkbeard and Iron Hammer and, you know, things like that. So, or Boneless. I never did figure that one out. There's a Boneless in there. So, at this time, Svein Forkbeard comes in, and he is running rampant over the countryside in England as a Viking, and his son Knut comes in. Knut fights a battle with Edmund Ironside and defeats him. Well, Knut agrees that they will split the kingdom between them, the kingdom of England. Knut is from Denmark. Well, Edmund Ironside only lives for one more year after that. When he dies, Knut takes over. He is the king of Denmark, Norway, and England. Here you have a Dane who is now the king of England. And the issue is Emma, because she had helped bring peace between the houses of England and Normandy, she's very popular. The English like her a lot, and they're very sorry that she has left and gone back to Normandy. So Knut, after 1 year of trying to rule England, and people not being too happy with him because here he is a Viking being the king of England, he decides that he is going to invite Emma to come back from Normandy and marry him because her husband has died. You know, Ethelred the Unready is dead. Emma is unmarried and available, so Knut invites her to come back. So this woman ended up being first the wife of the Saxon king of England, and then the wife of the Danish king of England, Knut. She is really the linchpin in all of this thing. To understand the whole Norman conquest, you have to go back to this woman and this marriage that she had. Later on, as we move along with it, we will find out that her children and her relatives are the ones that create the whole concern. Ethelred the Unready really wasn't ready. Edmund Ironside, his son, became king for a year, and then Knut the Great becomes king. Both Ethelred and Knut had been married to Emma of Normandy, which means Knut is the king and Emma is the queen of England, Denmark, and Norway. It is an English Scandinavian kingdom that they rule. The important part here is to understand that England is very much connected to Scandinavia now and not to the rest of Europe. Okay, even though she was from Normandy.
What year was that? 10?
This is in the 1050s that all this is happening. Now, at this point, Knut dies, and he and Emma had intended for their son Harthacnut to become king of England, Norway, and Denmark. But Harthacnut is off in Denmark dealing with some other problems they have in their kingdom, and when he's gone and Knut dies, his brother, his half-brother from a different woman, becomes king. He steps up. His name is Harold Harefoot. Apparently he's very quick, and so they name him Harefoot, Harold I. He becomes king for 5 years. He dies. His half-brother, who is the son of Emma of Normandy and Knut, becomes king. King of England, of Norway, of Denmark. And that's all fine until Harthacnut dies. There are no more descendants from Knut. He has no more children or grandchildren who can take over as king. And so at this point, the Danish rule, the Danish line ruling England ends. And Edward the Confessor, who was, again, a child of Emma of Normandy, but by her first husband, Alfred II, becomes the king. And he's the king for 24 years. He's called the Confessor because he was very religious. He built a lot of monasteries and churches. He was very concerned about spiritual matters. He was not a very good king. He was more concerned about spiritual matters than he was about matters of the kingdom. And so the Confessor is basically a way of saying he wasn't very good at this, but it was a holy man. He was a righteous guy. So Edward the Confessor comes along. He does not have any heirs. And here's where it gets interesting. Edmund the Confessor had spent some time in Normandy when the Danes were ruling. And because he was in the line of possible inheritance of the throne, he was always in danger. So he had spent some time in Normandy, and there he had gotten to know his great-nephew, who has been descended Richard I, Duke of Normandy, who is the father of Emma, had another child, Richard II, who had a son, Duke of Normandy Robert, who had an illegitimate son who he named William. He actually was called William the Bastard. Everybody knew him as that because he was illegitimate. But he was acknowledged by his father, Robert the Duke of Normandy, and Robert got all of the senior people in Normandy to agree that when he died, that William would become the Duke of Normandy, and he did. Well, Edward the Confessor had spent time in Normandy, and he got to know William, who was 30 years younger, but still had become the Duke very early. William had a very hard early life, had become quite the scrapper, and was a very strong political leader as the Duke of Normandy. Apparently, Edward the Confessor, who had no heirs, had promised William that when he died, he would name William his successor. Now recognize, they are from the same roots. That both of them looked to the Duke of Normandy as their grandfather or great-great-grandfather. Emma of Normandy was the mother of Edward the Confessor and the great-aunt of William the Conqueror. This is why you always see genealogies in any book about British stuff, because trying to figure out who's who and who deserves to be where and all of that. So Edward the Confessor promised William that he would be his successor as King of England. The most powerful leader after the king in England at that time was a guy named Harold Godwinson from the House of Godwin. Harold Godwinson had been visiting on the coast in Europe and had been captured by an enemy, Count Guy of Ponthieu. Well, Count Guy of Ponthieu owed William of Normandy a debt, and William of Normandy said, "Release your prisoner to me. Don't hold him for ransom," which is what they usually would have done. "Release him to me, and that will fulfill your debt." So he did. And then Harold Godwinson was released by William the Conqueror after Harold said, "When Edward the Confessor names you his heir, I will support you." And he was the most important, besides the king, the most important political figure in England at that time. So William thought, hey, I'm in. I am going to be the King of England. Unfortunately, when Edward dies, on his deathbed, he names Harold Godwinson as his successor. And Harold, conveniently, forgets to tell anybody that he has promised to support William of Normandy as the next King of England. Okay, you got all that? Mm-hmm. Is everybody still awake?
Yeah.
So if I can help you sleep, if you need a nap, I'm always happy to do that, okay? So, this is what that looks like. you had 3 Danish kings of Britain. There is Knut, and then his 2 sons, Harold the First, who is Harefoot, and Harthacnut. When Harthacnut dies, no other heirs, so the return of the House of Wessex and Edward the Confessor. Edward promised William of Normandy he would be his successor, and the other important figure, Harold Godwinson, had promised to support William. But Edward the Confessor names Harold Godwinson, and leaves William the Conqueror out in the cold. Well, I told you he was a scrapper. He wasn't going to take that lion down. So, that's where we come to William the Conqueror. William was the Duke and therefore heir of the properties of Normandy. In 1064, he had also conquered Brittany, which is where we're going to be when we visit Brest. Brest is right there. He had also conquered Maine. He was a close ally to Henry I, who was the king of France. He was a very significant power player in all of this stuff, but he was illegitimate, and that's probably the reason that they convinced Edmund on his deathbed not to name him as his successor. Now, what happens? William gets together an army and a group of ships to take him to England in order to conquer England and claim what he believes is his right to be king. And he gathers along the coast in Normandy. But the English Channel is very rough water, and especially back in the days where you had to depend upon sail and tide, you couldn't just power through it. They end up waiting for weeks because the tide and the wind is not right for them to be able to get to England. Well, the whole time, this is London, the whole time Harold, who has been named King of England, is waiting with his army. And waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, in early September, Harold decides, I can't keep these guys together anymore. He's just getting ready to release his army when he finds out that he's been invaded on the other end of the country. Up in Northumbria, in the north of England, an army has landed under 2 leaders. One is the half-brother of Harold, the King of England, whose name is Tostig. Tostig had once been the Earl of Northumbria. The people of Northumbria didn't like him. They threw him out, and Harold, his brother, didn't support him. And so Tostig is still mad about this, and so he's going to rebel and try to get the kingship. Harold, the fellow that's with him, is called Harthacnut. Harthacnut was a very tough fellow from, he was at that point, he had taken over as king of Norway. He at one point had been the head of the Varangian Guard for the Byzantine Emperor. He married a Russian princess. He's quite the character. The 2 of them land in Northumbria with an army, and they are going to take over England. Well, Harold is down here in London with his army, and he marches north over 200 miles. He marches his army in 4 days. Can you imagine on foot going 200 miles, carrying all the stuff you need to fight a battle? No trucks to carry anything. They march up there. By the time they get there, the army that's invaded has already defeated one other English army under 2 earls. And apparently they're celebrating. The Norwegians are having a great time of it because they've already won 1 battle. Well, when Harold gets there with his army, he fights a battle at Stamford Bridge, and he defeats this army. Both Tostig, his half-brother, and Harthacnut are killed. Well, he's won the battle. He has defeated an invading army. Just as he defeats that army, he finds out William has finally landed down here at Pevensey, which is near the city of the town of Hastings. All of a sudden, he's 250 miles. He's on the wrong side of the country to deal with the army he was really expecting to invade. So they march another 200 miles down to London, barely pause, and then march 50 more miles to get down here to Hastings. Here. Meanwhile, William has crossed the channel, landed at Pevensey, comes up here to Hastings, and ends up prepared for a battle. Harold, the King of England, now we're only talking about armies of about 7,000 people. These are not huge armies. You know, when Napoleon, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon had 120,000 soldiers. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But so we've got armies of 7,000 facing each other, but still that was quite a few to have transported across the channel. Harold sets up at the top of a ridge, and he puts up a shield wall. He's at the top of a little hill. A shield wall was where the soldiers in that day would stand with shields edge to edge and prepare, and when somebody attacked them, they would fight them off. And so sometimes it would be two shield walls pushing against each other to see who was going to have more force. Well, Harold at the top of a hill with a shield wall is in a very good defensive position, and when William gets there with his soldiers, including some cavalry, he's not having any luck at first. The archers are having trouble shooting uphill and hitting anything because, of course, it's just bouncing off of the shields. The cavalry is having trouble charging uphill, and so it looks like Harold is going to win. The King of England is going to fight off William the Conqueror. If that had happened, it would be a very different world now. But the cavalry, finally, in sort of a last-minute ditch effort, the first thing that happens is that word starts spreading, a rumor starts spreading, that William has died. He's been killed in the battle. And so his guys are starting to lose their confidence. Well, William the Conqueror takes off his helmet, which is something you did not do in those days with archers and all of that, and he starts riding along the front of his troops, rallying them, and they can see that he's still alive and that he's brave and he's ready to fight. So they keep at it, and the cavalry charges uphill against these shields, and they're not having any success, so they start to retreat. Well, William notices that when his cavalry starts to retreat, some of the guys from Harold's line start breaking loose from their shield wall and wanting to follow them, thinking they're winning. Well, William, when he sees that, he has them do that several times. He has the cavalry charge and then intentionally retreat. And after several times, the shield wall thinks they're winning, and they stop sticking with their defensive line, and they start attacking down the hill. William's cavalry comes in from the sides, and they end up defeating them, even though Harold had been winning up until the very end. And so, William the Bastard became William the Conqueror by defeating King Harold of England at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. This is an image from the Bayou Tapestry. It's not actually a tapestry, it's a needlepoint, a huge thing that William's brother, who was the bishop of Bayou, had commissioned, and it tells the whole story of the leading up to, it's a huge thing, the story leading up to the battle, of what happened in the battle, and Harold, the King of England, is killed in the battle. His two brothers are killed in the battle, and a lot of the other nobles of England are killed in the battle. So there's really not anybody else left to challenge William as the king. He takes about a month, well, more than a month, to make his way up to England. One of the things that had happened in preparation for this battle is William was very smart from a public relations point of view. He had contacted the Pope in Rome and asked the Pope to support his effort to conquer England. Well, now, the Pope was upset with England because the Catholic Church in England had not been listening to his directions. They had a new Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the primary Catholic primate in England, who had usurped the position and was not listening to him, was not doing what he wanted. And so, and it's also true that when William said, "They vowed to me that I could be king," back in those days, a vow was very, very important. It's the only thing they really had to keep the law going. So the Pope said, because a vow was broken to you and because the English Catholics are not listening to me anyway, I'm going to support your effort to conquer England. He gave them a flag to fight under. So one of the first things that William did was he went from Pevensey, from Hastings, up to where the Archbishop of Canterbury was, and drove him off and sort of took over the see there. He then went to Winchester and took over the treasury of England. Smart. You know, he's got the church on his side now, and he's got the money. Then he makes his way to London. He gets a different archbishop from York to agree to swear him in, to crown him as the King of England. They do that in London on Christmas Day of 1066, and he is the King of England. Now, for 5 more years, he has to fight battles in order to put down various rebellions. Some of the nobles didn't want him. There were still nobles around. The mother of Harold kept fighting against him. So he had various campaigns up and down England, fighting battles in order to put down the various rebellions. One of the things that he did was called the harrying of the North. There's an area north between York and Durham that, and this was common in these days, a harrying was when they went in and they destroyed all means of livelihood. They would burn the crops, they would poison the wells, they would kill the animals. And it meant that people there starved to death. But after doing that for a while, people stopped rebelling. And this was the way it was done back then. And so he harried the north between York and Durham and ended up finally, after 5 years, suppressing all of the opposition that he had. One of the things that you will see if you travel in England or along the coast in Britain, you will see lots of various Norman castles. What that means is these were designed by the followers of William the Conqueror, and he built these castles and churches and towers and monasteries all over England, especially the castles. They did not have stone castles before this. They would put up wooden barricades or wooden towers. But when William came in, he knew that because he's going to have opposition, he needed to have strong points. And so he built these kinds of towers. Whenever you see a castle with this kind of construction, including this is the Tower of London, Windsor Castle was a Norman construction. It was built by William. These are the things that he did in order to really solidify his control of the country. And it was one of the things, the whole idea of the Norman buildings were called Romanesque. And so whenever you see Romanesque architecture, that is something that was introduced by William the Conqueror and his followers. In fact, that influenced the whole coastline. And when we go tomorrow, those of you who are going to the Compostela de Santiago, the cathedral there, the early building of it was Romanesque. Later on they added Baroque and some other touches, but it was Romanesque originally. So there was a large influence in terms of the architectural style that they had back then. In terms of the effect this had, the title of my talk is How 1066 Changed Everything. Well, it changed more than just the architecture. When William the Conqueror took over England, he forced the English to be focused much more on France and continent of Europe rather than on Scandinavia. Remember, they had all these Vikings that had come down from Norway and Denmark. They had 3 generations, or 3 different kings, 2 generations, who were Danish kings. England had been very much oriented towards Scandinavia and not toward the continent of Europe, France, and in Spain and the other parts of it, until William came along. Because William the Conqueror owned land in France. He was still the Duke of Normandy and of Brittany and of Maine, but he was also the King of England. Then he had a concern. In fact, he spent a huge amount of his time, as did his children, going back and forth because they had other things to maintain in Brittany and other parts of France. So all of a sudden, England is now focused on the continent of Europe. And from that point on, England would be a major player in what's happening in the central continent of Europe, rather than seeing itself as connected to Scandinavia and not to the rest of the continent. Now, that made a huge difference in terms of the future and what the focus would be. You get an example here that along with controlling England, there were chunks in France. The red is what is actually owned by the Norman kings in England. The green is what is sort of under their control. This is Brittany, where we will be in a few days. So there was always a focus, a reorienting of their thoughts back toward the continent. In addition to that, there was a huge change in the approach that England took toward education, toward theology, philosophy, those kinds of things. For instance, there were no universities in England prior to this time. Once the connection started being made between France and England, a number of promising students went to the University of Paris. And that caused there to be a demand for higher education in England. And as a result of that, in 1160, so we're talking about less than a century after the Battle of Hastings, Oxford is built, the first major university in England, and Cambridge followed that, and other universities. That was part of the influence. So the education, the intellectual pursuits, the theological processes, because they became connected much more with the continental kind of thinking, those were all effects. But the biggest probably thing that we're aware of is the change in the language. Did any of you all start out with a different language and then have to learn English? Does anybody have English as a second language? How tough was that for you? Right? Yeah. Well, we live in Mexico, and so we study Spanish, and that's hard enough for us. I feel so bad for people who have like Spanish as their first language and then they have to learn English, because the English vocabulary is more than a quarter, the whole vocabulary is more than 250,000 words. We have multiple words for everything. I mean, you can eat or you can dine. You can buy clothing or you can buy a wardrobe. And the reason why we have so many different words, there are more than twice as many words in English, for instance, than there is in Spanish. But the reason is because English is originally a Germanic language. But then we have a lot of the Norse language came into it because of all the Vikings, and especially we have French coming because of William the Conqueror. William never did in his life learn to speak English. The nobles during his time and following in England tended to speak French in any formal setting. In fact, for many, many generations after that, the standard language of polite company was French because of William the Conqueror. They would use English in every day. I mean, if you're talking to your family, you would speak English, but if you're speaking to your boss, you would speak French, because English was considered a lower level language. Today, about 26% of the English language is Germanic in origin. 29% is French in origin, and 29% is Latin in origin, because prior to William the Conqueror, all public documents in England were written in what was Old English. And when the French came in, they started speaking French, but all the formal documents were written in Latin, which is another thing that affected the intellectual attitude that they had. If you go through the list of words today in English that are sourced either directly or indirectly from French words, it's astonishing. Again, almost 1/3 of all the words in the English language are French, and they're there because of William and of the changes that occurred then. So the relationships that they had with the continent, the architectural, the intellectual pursuits, the language, everything changed when William the Conqueror took over England in 1066. And most of us are probably from either the continental, the French kind of side, or the English side. I think most of you are from the U.S., and so we are direct descendants of that. We're affected by all that as well. William the Conqueror changed everything in 1066. So now you always remember what 1066 is for, right? Any questions? What can I answer for you? Yes?
One of the reasons that he became more involved in France logistically, was it closer than going to Scandinavia?
He started in France. I mean, he was William of Normandy. So he came from here.
Right.
And so, because he still owned this property, actually, he still had to pay, and this is one of the reasons, the 100 Years' War, we're going to get into that a little bit, but he still had to pay he had to pay homage to the King of France, who technically was still king over that, but he was the Duke over it. But, so he's the King of England. This thing is jumping on me. He's the King of England. He is still the Duke of Normandy, of Maine, and the controller of Brittany. And so that's why the focus was here, rather than Scandinavia. All right? And it's like England did about a 90-degree turn in terms of where its focus was after that. Other questions? Yes?
What did France amount to at that time? Just after
Well, wow. What is... This was, Ile-de-France was completely controlled by the King of France at that point. but they had relationships. There were various other dukes that ran this part. Later on, all of this would be consolidated into France. But you're right, this purple part is the only part that the King of France owned at that point. The others would do homage to him as provinces, but they still had a great deal of independence, as William did in Normandy. Later on, France obviously would become a great power and would be the primary enemy opponent of England in so many ways. And the 100 Years' War was a good illustration of that. Other questions?
Who was the King of France then?
Henry the First at the time of William, and then we get into the Louis later on. But Henry the First was King of France then. Other questions? Great, I appreciate it. You now know about Hastings and Norman Conquest.